What we generally see, if Japan does, for example, has a joint exercise within the Quad, we will see those merchant vessels in increased numbers go in and out of the waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands. And when there's relative less tension in the relationship, the numbers go down. So it's a gauge to see how much displeasure there is in Beijing about Japan's cooperation within the Quad or statements on Taiwan. So I think the leaders are very reticent to criticize each country because they want to maintain those strong economic relations. So we see very little criticism about President Xi by Japanese politicians, and very little criticism about Japanese politicians by Chinese counterparts. But they send their displeasure through an increased number of vessels in and around Japanese waters, or in the case of Taiwan, of course, circumnavigating Taiwan with fighter planes.
China and Japan mark the 50th anniversary of normalization of diplomatic ties this year, but the mood is not celebratory. In 2021, some 71% of Japanese said China posed a threat, up from 63% in 2020. Likewise, 66% of Chinese had negative views of Japan, up from 53%. Perhaps economic ties might soothe relations. China hopes to further strengthen economic ties through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. China and Japan are among its 15 member nations.
I do think that there is bright spots in terms of thinking about Sino-Japanese relations. First, at the trade level, they continue to cooperate in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This will spearhead further integration within the region. There is some talk about a trilateral free trade agreement between South Korea, China, and Japan. So in that sense, there's still a commitment to engaging with China at the trade level. Japan remains committed to the Chinese economy. And the Chinese government, especially at the local level, is very committed to a strong economic relations between China and Japan. It's Japanese businesses that have hired millions of Chinese in China. They provide technological infusion, human capacity building, and local governments in China welcome that investment. So those ties remain strong, but of course the direction of China today is moving towards a more inward-looking, I think, nationalist view, and this will impact, I think, those strong ties that have maintained a relative balance between the two states up to now.
In March 2022, South Korea elected a new president. Yoon Suk-yeol promised to be tougher on China during his campaign.
지금 현 정부가 굉장히 중국 편향적인 이런 정책을 써왔습니다마는 한국 국민들, 특히 청년들의 대부분은 중국을 싫어합니다. 그리고 중국 사람들, 중국의 청년들의 대부분이 또 한국을 싫어합니다. 근데 과거에는 그렇지 않았습니다. 이렇게 중국 편향적인 정책을 쓰고.
In his first press conference after his victory, Yoon said that he wants to bolster South Korea's defense capabilities and strengthen cooperation with the United States and Japan.
국민의 안전과 재산, 영토와 주권을 지키기 위해 어떠한 도발도 확실하게 억제할 수 있는 강력한 국방력을 구축하겠습니다.
After years of careful and strategic political maneuvering, tending to relations with China, the US, and North Korea, President Yoon was redrawing lines. This realignment comes on the back of a string of cultural clashes.
Recently, I would say more from the South Korean public side, there have been a series of these incidents that have really upset people. You know, claims about kimchi being Chinese. During the Winter Olympics, this flared up over the presentation of hanbok, of Korean traditional dress, being presented as one of the ethnic minority costumes in the opening ceremony.
remarks and representations which might have assaulted cultural nerves of South Koreans.
Some of these cultural storms, I think, would just be that. They'd be a storm in a teacup, and everyone would just move on. But each one of these incidents just slowly, it keeps tipping the lever, and we've seen this in polling to indicate the general view of China among the South Korean public is increasingly negative.
Incidents on the high seas contribute to that negativity. As Chinese demand for seafood increases, its fishing fleet finds itself pushing the limits of its territorial boundaries.
This is another one of these chronic irritants that goes back for decades in the relationship, and we've seen that actually become quite violent, and you've seen loss of life at sea on both sides, but in particular, you've seen South Korean Coast Guards die in these clashes. So it's a real problem. It's a chronic problem.
China's fishing vessels' illegal encroachment caused the economic loss to the South Korean fishermen. So it caused a kind of anti-China sentiment at the civilian level. South Korea and China started to proceed the maritime boundary negotiations, and they made efforts to root out those Chinese fishing vessels' illegal invasion.
But it is defense issues that create complex diplomatic scuffles between South Korea and China. In 2016, South Korea deployed THAAD, an anti-missile system designed to shoot down incoming missiles. It was a system that was supposed to shield them from North Korean missiles.
South Korea deployed a THAAD system for its national security, but China approached it through the prism of US-China relations. They perceived that the THAAD system was to spy on its territory.
The Chinese authorities retaliated by closing nearly half of Lotte's 112 stores across China. South Korean firms suffered losses of an estimated $7.5 billion.
Lotte was probably the poster child of here's what we'll do to you, South Korea, if you make a national security decision that we don't approve of. You know, we will take it out on you economically. That was the message that South Korea received over THAAD, and it's certainly not been forgotten. It left a very bad long-term impression and negativity toward China that they'd be willing to do that they would be willing to create that kind of economic pain on South Korea for a national security decision.
After the THAAD incident, I think South Korea learned the risk of economic dependence on China. With the intensifying US-China relations, it turns out South Korea should make more careful approach to South Korea-China relations within the structure of US-China confrontation.
While former President Moon Jae-in has tried to pacify the Chinese, much of that diplomacy might come to naught because of incoming President Yoon Suk-yeol. The new president was voted in on rising anti-Chinese sentiment.
서로의 그 안보를 피로써 지키기로 약속한 그런 국가이기 때문에 거기에 걸맞는 그런 관계가 다시 자리를 잡아야 될 것으로 저는 생각합니다.
In the lead up to the elections, President Yoon had pledged to deploy additional units of the THAAD anti-missile system.
I think it is a kind of rhetoric to secure the conservative vote by emphasizing the difference from the Moon Jae-in government. The priority of his foreign policy is to abandon the strategic ambiguity and reinforce the South Korea-US alliance.
If the new administration makes a decision, yeah, we want as many THAAD batteries as we can take, the Chinese are almost certainly going to return to the kind of economic punishment that they did before. That's going to cost South Koreans on the economic ledger. And is that a cost that they really want to absorb right now? You know, what's the cost-benefit analysis?
Will it be a risk South Korea is willing to take? South Korea abandoned its nuclear weapons development in the 1970s, but a survey conducted in December 2021 showed 71% of South Koreans were in favor of the country developing its own nuclear weapons.
The perception shift in South Korea, I think, was caused by the fact that there is no sign of improvement in denuclearizing North Korea. South Korea's nuclear armament can be a great military pressures on South Korea and China. But at the same time, it is highly likely to intensify military tensions and arms race in the region instead.
But for now, I don't see that as, again, something that the new administration right out of the gates is going to say, okay, great, we're here, and South Korea wants its own nuclear weapon. That would be a highly destabilizing geopolitical move for the region, and I'm not sure that that really serves South Korea's interests.
Whether or not South Korea participates in the Quad, or Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, is also a subject of debate. The Quad has Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S. as member countries.
There's also questions of whether the Quad actually wants South Korea as a member. I would not say that Japan-South Korea relations are particularly good, and Japan is obviously a core member of the Quad. So does Tokyo really want South Korea diluting the Quad brand with its presence? I think that's actually an open question.
Chinese state media warn South Korea that joining the Quad will damage relations.
I think we've definitely shifted towards what we call a bipolar system. The two big poles, of course, are the United States and China. So what does this mean? If we moved into a bipolar world, it suggests that the United States and like-minded countries are going to build deterrence capabilities, build engagement capabilities, and of course, when there's disagreements with China, push back against China's actions. And China as well is going to start to build its own network of countries, I think mostly emerging countries, through the BRI, as well as insulate its economy from future fiscal sanctions that they've watched be very effective against the Russian economy, to create a Chinese sphere of influence through the BRI. And this is how I understand global order moving forward.
Whether there will be a new international order, I do not know. I love the current international order. China has benefited a great deal by fully becoming integrated with the international order, we understand it, and China will be a champion of defending the current international order. What China does not like is for any country in the world try to dictate its will onto any other country in the world. Now, that may apply to the United States. We do not want to see a unilateral world involving any single power holding itself as a hegemon, dictating its terms to all the other countries. We actually do not like to see any country holding itself out as possessing the total truth, the complete truth, nothing but the truth. Why? Because we simply do not believe it.
A new world order can be very confusing because our world order is actually very dynamic and changing. Believe me, when China becomes the #1 economy in the world, that will be another significant shift in the world. So we are clearly experiencing major changes, but at the same time, we can try to make these changes all peaceful. We need to step up the level of diplomatic engagement and have far more dialogues, more face-to-face diplomacy in East Asia.